Hey everybody, this is an entry from Robert J. Alexander's History of International Trotskyism. Um, the title of this entry is U.S. Trotskyism, the Socialist Workers' Party in the 1970s and early 1980s. After the heyday of its activity and influence in the late 1960s and early 1970s, the Socialist Workers' Party reoriented itself in several ways. In the late 1970s, it adopted the strategy of, quote, colonizing, end quote, the organized labor movement, which it had earlier rejected. By the early 1980s, the party was going through an internal discussion and struggle in which the majority of the leadership seemed to be moving toward complete ideological reorientation, which, if it continued, seemed likely to take the Socialist Workers' Party entirely out of the world Trotskyist movement. Quote, objective, end quote, causes of Socialist Workers' Party reorientation. The changes in Socialist Workers' Party strategy and the growing trend toward a complete ideological realignment are certainly in part a reflection of the changing milieu in which the party had to work, the constituencies in which it built up its strength and in the 1960s and very early 1970s either largely disappeared or took directions which were not hospitable to the party's further growth. The anti-Vietnam War movement died a natural death. It was seriously undermined when President Nixon introduced the, quote, lottery, end quote, system of conscription, with the result that college students were no longer under the constant menace of being drafted, but instead knew for sure that they either were going to go, or, in the great majority of cases, that they were not going to be called up. The movement completely collapsed with the U.S. defeat in Vietnam. Black nationalism suffered a somewhat different kind of retrogression. With the broadening of the possibilities for political action and influence within the established major parties, most politically active blacks became oriented toward the more mundane, if less exciting work of gaining influence and elective positions through these parties, particularly the Democratic Party. The, quote, nationalist, end quote, appeal among blacks therefore became less attractive. Furthermore, the black nationalist leader with whom the Socialist Workers' Partiers had established contact, Malcolm X, had been killed even before the end of the 1960s, and the Socialist Workers' Party people were not successful in winning over any of his close associates or fellows. I believe Malcolm X was assassinated in 1965. That's just me saying that. That's not the text. The fate of black nationalism is perhaps best symbolized by the transformation of the black Muslim movement and the rejection by its majority of its former general antipathy toward all whites. The feminist movement underwent somewhat the same experience. With the extension of more opportunities for leadership within the established political structure, increasingly large numbers of politically oriented women sought to take advantage of these opportunities. Other movements in which the Socialist Workers' Party had taken an interest and sought to become active, such as those of Chicanos and homosexuals, experienced somewhat the same development. Becoming increasingly interested in making immediate gains, they also tended increasingly to work within the established order rather than openly revolt against it. The dozen or so years after 1972 were, on balance, a conservative period. University students, among whom the Socialist Workers' Party had recruited with particular success in the preceding period, generally became concerned with mundane questions of grades and career opportunities, and their proclivity for political activity of all kinds, particularly radical political activity, drastically declined. Among the general population, there tended to be a reaction against what the Socialist Workers' Party had called the, quote, radicalization, end quote, of the 1960s and the very early 1970s. This trend culminated in the election in 1980 of Ronald Reagan, the principal figure in the right wing of the Republican Party and certainly the most conservative president since Calvin Coolidge. Decline of Socialist Workers' Party, Young Socialist Alliance. The consequence of changed, quote, objective, end quote, circumstances was a decline in the membership and influence of the main U.S. Trotskyist grouping. Although the Socialist Workers' Party did not make public information on its membership, the Young Socialist Alliance did, and their figures indicated a drastic decline in the later part of the 1970s. One can only surmise that, although it may not have been as marked in the adult organization as in the Young Socialist Alliance, the Socialist Workers' Party also suffered at least to some degree from a similar fall in membership. At the time of the 1972 convention of the Young Socialist Alliance, it was reported that 200 delegates were, quote, representing 60 YSA locals in 30 states, end quote. The Young Socialist Alliance probably reached its high point in 1975 and 1976. At the 1976 convention, the Young Socialist Alliance was reported, at the 1976 convention, it was reported that there were 1,400 members and 65 chapters. A year later, a sharp drop in membership was reported by Chuck Petrin, the National Organizational Secretary. It was down to 800. In part, this drop was attributed to the fact that, quote, many YSA members who were also in the Socialist Workers' Party left the Young Socialist Alliance to devote their energies to build the Socialist Workers' Party, end quote. At the January 1978 YSA convention, National Organizational Secretary Betsy Farley reported on experiments, quote, with new organizational forms, end quote. Betsy Farley described the impact of these changes on the Young Socialist Alliance. Quote, while on the one hand, they had helped the Young Socialist Alliance to achieve its goal of becoming firmly rooted on the college campuses, they also had some negative effects, leading to a breakdown in collaboration between the Young Socialist Alliance and the Socialist Workers' Party, end quote. Betsy Farley. By late 1979, Roger Horowitz of the National Committee of the Young Socialist Alliance was writing in the organization's internal bulletin that, quote, to be blunt, the Young Socialist Alliance is in trouble right now. Our membership has fallen to less than 400. Our average age is over 23. Sales of our press have gone from 4,000 last spring to 3,000 this fall, and most significantly, recruitment of new members is way down, end quote. Clearly, the impetus which had made the Young Socialist Alliance the largest radical youth group in the late 1960s and early 1970s and had substantially bolstered the Socialist Workers' Party as well had run out of steam by the second half of the 1970s. There were also indications that the Socialist Workers' Party itself was undergoing some difficulties. The size of its newspaper, The Militant, was reduced, and their international news organ, Intercontinental Press, was cut back from a weekly to a bi-weekly. These trends sufficiently justified the Socialist Workers' Party in reorienting itself in the more traditional Trotskyist direction of trying to become a predominantly working-class party composed of largely trade unionists. The turn to industry. Socialist Workers' Party explanation of the turn to industry. By the mid-1970s, the Socialist Workers' Party had shown some signs of a renewed interest in trying to work within the trade union movement. It was reported that in his political report to the 1976 convention of the party, National Secretary Jack Barnes, quote, pointed to the profound interrelation between the political struggles of the oppressed in American society as a whole and the fight for a class struggle left in the American labor movement, end quote, Jack Barnes. Jack Barnes cited the example of, quote, the fight for democracy going on inside the Steelworkers Union today. This struggle is already attracting activists among the oppressed nationalities and fighters for women's rights, end quote. Jack Barnes. It is clear that in the 1976 convention, the Socialist Workers' Party was still principally oriented toward ethnic and similar interest groups. For instance, the article on the convention which appeared in Intercontinental Press noted that, quote, 44% of the delegates were women, up from 36 in 1975, end quote, and that, quote, the National Committee elected at the convention includes 20 members of oppressed nationalities, as compared with 15 on the outgoing committee, end quote, but makes no reference to the number of delegates or committee members who belong to unions. It was not until early 1978 that the Socialist Workers' Party decided generally to reorient the party's activities toward the labor movement. Will Reisner, reporting on the 1979 party convention, noted that, quote, the decision to do this was made at a February 1978 meeting of the Socialist Workers' Party National Committee. It flowed from the Socialist Workers' Party evaluation of the worldwide capitalist austerity drive and the growing alienation of American workers from the institutions of capitalist rule had created new opportunities for the party to do fruitful political work in the major workplaces and unions of industrial workers. These openings, the National Committee decided, made it imperative that the Socialist Workers' Party concentrate its efforts on becoming a party of socialist industrial workers through colonization of cadres who had been recruited in the movement for movements for social change over the past 2 decades, end quote. Will Reisner. Will Reisner also noted that the decision was in conformity with the policy of the United Secretariat, quote, to make such a turn toward the industrial working class throughout the world, end quote. In arguing in favor of the new, quote, turn to industry, end quote, for the Socialist Workers' Party, the leaders of the party stressed several reasons for it. The first was that American capitalism was allegedly entering a profound new crisis. Early in 1978, Jack Barnes claimed that, quote, we have no Armageddon point of view based on conjunctural economic estimates. But we know that by 1974 to 75, we had entered a period of crises for capitalism, one we will not come out of without gigantic battles for power. That's what we are convinced of, end quote. Jack Barnes. The Socialist Workers' Party leaders also argued that the middle-class radicals with whom they had worked so closely in the 1960s and early 1970s had by the late 1970s turned conservative. After 1980, they accused those people of being, quote, Marielitos, end quote. That is, people fleeing from the revolution, as 130,000 Cubans had done when they left Cuba from the small port of Mariel. In March 1982, Barnes argued that, quote, there is no question whatsoever that we face a Mariel in American radical movement. That is, without doubt, what is happening on the United States left as the blows against the working class come down, as the polarization deepens, and as the imperialist war pressure mounts. The difference between conditions and consciousness born of being a worker and that produced by being immersed in a petty bourgeois milieu is widening. And the ranks of the North American Marielitos are growing. End quote. Jack Barnes. The Socialist Workers' Party leaders claimed that as middle-class radicals were turning conservative, the workers, particularly the workers in heavy industry, had moved to, quote, center stage, end quote, of U.S. politics. Thus, in presenting the motion to the February 1978 plenum where the turn to industry was decided upon, Jack Barnes argued that, quote, prior to 1974, much of the political activity took the course around and not through either the industrial unions or the workers in industry. But following Nixon's 1971 wage freeze, that changed. As we got closer to the 1974 to 75 depression, it changed more and more. Prior to this, though, the best arena for recruitment to our working class programs was not in these unions, end quote. Jack Barnes. Jack Barnes went on to say that, quote, we are still in a preparatory period, not a period when we are leading mass class struggle actions. We must make no mistake about that, But it is a preparatory period in which the center of American politics is shifted to the industrial working class. That's the central political judgment we put before the plenum. By not making this move now, we would unnecessarily cut ourselves off from the center of American politics, end quote. Furthermore, the industrial workers were, according to the Socialist Workers' Party leadership, becoming more radical. In his February 1978 speech, Jack Barnes argued that, quote, the political committee became convinced that there are more workers developing anti-capitalist sentiment or greater openness to anti-capitalist conclusions and solutions today than at any other time in American history, end quote. The turn to industry and practice. During the first half of 1979, the Socialist Workers' Party held national conferences of its members in the United Steelworkers, United Auto Workers, International Association of Machinists, and the railroad unions. Malik Mia reported that, quote, the purpose of the 4 industrial conferences was to bring together socialist activists in these unions to discuss the impact of the capitalist offensive in each particular industry and its workforce, and to exchange experiences about how workers are resisting the anti-labor assaults. Most important, the meetings were held to discuss and decide what socialist workers, acting together as a national team, can do to move these struggles forward and win new supporters and members to the socialist movement, end quote. The, quote, colonization, end quote, strategy was endorsed by the 30th National Convention of the Socialist Workers' Party in August 1979. The policy was overwhelmingly endorsed, only one vote being cast for a, quote, counter-resolution, end quote, entitled, quote, Against the Workers' Turn, a critique and some proposals, end quote. By late 1982, it was reported that, quote, today about half of the party members hold industrial jobs and some 76% are either in industry, temporarily laid off from industrial jobs, or have left such jobs for a brief period to work full-time for the party, end quote. At the same time, it was noted that although a number of party members employed in the basic industries had been laid off, quote, the number hired in other sectors of the economy, such as petrochemical, garment, and electric, has compensated for these layoffs, end quote. Barnes summed up the new Socialist Workers' Party's alleged position in the industrial field in 1982 by saying that, quote, the most important test for us was a very simple one. We went through a bad year of depression with massive layoffs and massive pressures, yet there's no fundamental change in the party. Some fractions have been weakened, some people have changed jobs, but the party as a whole hasn't been changed. We haven't fled from the industrial working class as a result of these pressures. We're in to stay. We're part of what's going on. We're more and more not going through an experiment, but going through these experiences as part of the working class, end quote. Jack Barnes. In July-August 1982, the Socialist Workers' Party held one of its more or less regular educational conferences, at which particular attention was given to the role of party members in the labor movement. Some 1,200 people reportedly attended. End quote. About half of those attending were workers from major industries and unions where the Socialist Workers' Party and Young Socialist Alliance ... have many members: coal mining, steel, auto, rail, garment and textile, petrochemical, electrical, aerospace and machinist, transit, and teamsters, end quote. About half of those participating were under 38, end quote. Some 73 participants were Afro-Americans and 66 were Latinos, end quote. This conference was the occasion for fraction meetings of Socialist Workers' Party workers in various fields. There were 100 classes held during the 6 days of the sessions dealing with, quote, 3 broad areas: Marx, Engels, and revolutionary politics, the class struggle in the United States, and international revolutionary developments, end quote. Particular attention was given to, quote, a 5-part series on the workers' and farmers' government presented by Steve Clark, a member of the Socialist Workers' Party Political Bureau, end quote. The Socialist Workers' Party renewed its old interest in the question of establishing a labor party in the United States. Thus, in an article commenting on the doubts about whether such a party is likely to appear, expressed by British Labour Party left-wing leader Anthony Wedgwood Benn, Tony Benn, Frank Lovell wrote in The Militant on November 7th, 1980 that, quote, the working class, and only the working class, is capable of reorganizing society and eliminating the evils of capitalism. And to accomplish this historic mission, the working class must organize its own political party in all countries of the world and propose being to... The purpose being to establish the world socialist order for the liberation of all humankind. This is what socialists learned from Marx and Engels, and they understood that anyone who claimed to be a socialist and joined one of the master class political parties which exists for the sole purpose of deceiving the voters was a renegade, end quote. Lovell added that, quote, in this country today, the union movement can become a greater power in government in a shorter time once the break with capitalist politics is made and the movement for a labor party begins to roll, end quote. Get some coffee. Particularities of the turn to industry. There were certain aspects of this new attempt of the Socialist Workers' Party to gain a base in the organized labor movement which deserves special note. They were strongly criticized by elements in the leadership of the party who were opposed to the faction headed by National Secretary Jack Barnes, which was principally responsible for proposing and carrying out the, quote, turn to industry, end quote. In the first place, the effort to reestablish a footing in the labor movement was confined almost exclusively to the unions of workers in heavy industry. While the, quote, turn, end quote, was underway, in fact, the small base which the Socialist Workers' Party did have in the white-collar professional union field was apparently liquidated. This appears not to have been the original intention of the Barnes leadership. In his speech to the February 1979 plenum, which launched the, quote, turn to industry, end quote, Barnes said, quote, this doesn't mean we won't do work in or pay careful attention to AFSCME or the teachers' union. In fact, we will grow. We will recruit bigger fractions to the in the AFT, NEA, AFSCME, and so on. This does not distract from the importance of the work of our comrades there either. We are making a concrete, explicit decision that we are not putting people in the AFSCME, the OPEIU, or the teachers' union as a normal policy, but we are going to recruit teachers and other public and clerical workers. We will have fractions in these unions, end quote. But a plenum of the Socialist Workers' Party National Committee in April 1981 decided to send virtually everyone except the party's own employees and members who were retired into the industrial unions. Malik Mia reported on this at the plenum in the name of the majority party leadership, quote, first is the need to deepen the turn itself. Currently, 50% of the party is in industry. About 10% of comrades are on layoff or looking for work. Then there is another 17% of the party on full-time staff or retired. This leaves approximately 20-25% of the party as potential candidates to get jobs in industry in their current cities or in new parts of the country, end quote. The result of this new interpretation of the, quote, turn to industry, end quote, was the liquidation of all Socialist Workers' Party fractions in the white-collar and professional unions. Two members who had been particularly active in AFSCME, the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, and the American Federation of Teachers, Ray Markey and Jeff Mackler, respectively, were told to cease their efforts in those organizations and were removed from the Socialist Workers' Party National Committee. Another peculiarity of the Socialist Workers' Party's attempt to penetrate the labor movement was the party leadership's apparent prohibition of Socialist Workers' Party members seeking or accepting any responsible union post. This sharply contrasted with traditional party policy in the 1930s through the 1950s when the Trotskyists held significant offices in a variety of unions. Finally, the Socialist Workers' Party, having, quote, assigned, end quote, members to a particular industry in a particular place, frequently, quote, reassigned, end quote, them elsewhere. as the, quote, platform adopted by the opposition groups in the Socialist Workers' Party National Committee in 1983 stated the situation, quote, "Our real isolation from the workers is further compounded by job hopping. A cavalier attitude toward holding a job is deliberately promoted, making it difficult or impossible for comrades to acquire the necessary experience in or knowledge about the struggles in their industry, making them perennial newcomers who cannot speak with authority, and alienating us from the workers who cannot afford this luxury. The policy of reassigning comrades from industry to industry has also left them with lowered seniority and thus more vulnerable to layoffs. All of this undermines our ability to build ongoing functioning fractions." End quote. After the first half-decade of this Socialist Workers' Party, quote, colonizing, end quote, strategy in the labor movement, there was no indication that the party had gained any substantial influence in organized labor comparable to that which it had enjoyed during the late 1930s, 1940s, and early 1950s. However, the renewed party emphasis on trying to acquire such influence so that it could become, at least to some degree, the, quote, vanguard, end quote, of the working class, in fact, rather than just in abstract theory, constituted a major reversal of Socialist Workers' Party strategy. It was a sharp break with the policies of almost a quarter of a century, during which the party had centered its attention and recruiting efforts principally on middle and upper class youth and on ethnic groups and special interest constituencies with no integral connection with the organized working class. Socialist Workers' Party electoral activities. The Socialist Workers' Party put its resources to a growing degree into party electoral activity. Not only did it run candidates in the 1972, 1976, 1980, and 1984 presidential elections, as had become its custom, but it put up nominees in increasingly large numbers of congressional contests as well as in state and local elections. In 1972, the Socialist Workers' Party named 31-year-old Linda Jenness and 21-year-old Andrew Pulley, a black, as their presidential and vice presidential candidates. The party's platform, What Socialists Want, indicated the range of issues the Socialist Workers' Party stressed during the campaign. The 13 points were, quote, "Bring all the troops home now, stop the bombing of Indochina," end quote. This is 1972, remember. Kind of jumping around dates here. Quote, "For a program to meet the needs of the working people," end quote. Quote, "End the burden of low-income families." Quote, "For the democratic right of black people to control their own communities," end quote. Quote, "Chicano liberation," end quote. Quote, "End the oppression of women," end quote. Quote, "Halt the destruction of the environment," end quote. Quote, "Support the demands of America's youth," end quote. Quote, "End inhuman treatment of prisoners," end quote. Quote, "For democratic election laws." Quote, "Full civil and human rights for gay people." Quote, "Protect and extend civil liberties." Quote, "For government ownership of industry." Quote, "For a socialist America," end quote. The Socialist Workers' Party national candidates in 1972 received 68,266 votes compared with 25,295 for the Communist Party ticket, 53,811 for the Socialist Labor Party, and 78,801 for Benjamin Spock, running as an independent leftist. In addition, the Socialist Workers' Party ran 95 candidates for other offices in 16 states, including nominees for governor of Texas, senator from Massachusetts, and candidates against black Congressman Charles Rangel in New York and Ron Dellums in California. 4 years later, in 1976, the Socialist Workers' Party named Pedro Camejo and Willie Mae Reed, a black, as their national nominees. Their candidacy was announced by the National Committee of the party on December 27, 1975. During the campaign, the party distributed over 1 million pieces of literature, and the candidates were, quote, interviewed by major daily newspapers and television stations throughout the country, end quote. They were on the ballot in 28 states and the District of Columbia. They made a particular point during the campaign of the lawsuit which the Socialist Workers' Party had begun against U.S. government espionage in the Socialist Workers' Party. Intercontinental Press noted that, quote, the combined approach of suing the government while running in the elections has been particularly effective, end quote. The Socialist Workers' Party candidates were endorsed by two dissident Trotskyist groups, the Workers' League and the Spark Group. In 1980, the Socialist Workers' Party named Andrew Pulley, still only 28 years old, for president and Matilda Zimmerman for vice president. One piece of campaign literature noted that Pulley was a member of United Steelworkers Local 1066 in Gary, Indiana, and had run for mayor of Chicago. Maybe it's Gary, Indiana. It just says Gary, but I think it's Indiana, right? And had run for mayor of Chicago in 1979 when Andrew Pulley, quote, reached thousands of working people through televised debates with his opponents and extensive radio and newspaper coverage. Andrew Pulley called on the labor movement to form its own party in opposition to the Democrats and Republicans to fight back against the capitalist offensive against working people's rights and living standards, end quote. The same document noted that Zimmerman was on the staff of the militant, had, quote, helped organize many anti-war demonstrations, end quote, belonged to the National Organization of Women, end quote, has campaigned in defense of abortion rights for passage of the Equal Rights Amendment and in support of affirmative action, end quote. The Socialist Workers' Party vote in 1980 was half of 4 years earlier. In the 1984 election, the Socialist Workers' Party named Mel Mason for president and Andrea Gonzalez for vice president. Mel Mason, a one-time Black Panther, was 41 years old and had been a member of the City Council of Seaside, California, as well as student activities coordinator of Monterey Peninsula College before resigning these posts to run for president. Andrea Gonzalez was National Secretary of the Young Socialist Alliance. Andrea Gonzalez was only 32. Throughout the country, the party fielded 58 candidates in 1984, including nominees for the U.S. Senate and House governorships and a few local positions. Mason and Gonzalez officially received 24,687 votes. The Socialist Workers' Party also ran candidates extensively in non-presidential years. In 1982, it put up nominees in 27 states in the District of Columbia, including Mel Mason, then a member of the Seaside City Council and of the Socialist Workers' Party National Committee, as nominee for governor of California. Mac Warren of the Socialist Workers' Party Political Bureau, after explaining to the July to August 1982 Socialist Workers' Party Educational Conference that, quote, the number one anti-war, anti-racist, anti-sexist, anti-capitalist activity we will be carrying out will be the socialist election campaigns, end quote. Expounding on the party's reasons for expending so much energy on electoral activity, quote, just think about what we are able to do over the course of the petitioning campaigns. We talked to hundreds of thousands of people all over the country. Hundreds of people signed cards asking for more information and got subscriptions to the militant. Many thousands of people signed our petitions not just because they support our democratic right to be on the ballot, but also because of what we have to say on fighting war, racism, and on the big issues of the day, end quote. The Socialist Workers' Party's suit against the government. A good deal of time and energy of leaders of the Socialist Workers' Party between 1973 and 1981 was taken up with the party's suit against the U.S. government. The suit got a great deal of attention in the Socialist Workers' Party press and some notice in the periodicals of other radical groups, with even occasional notice in the, quote, capitalist, end quote, press. The beginning of the court action was announced in the July 27, 1973 issue of The Militant. The periodical wrote that, quote, "The Socialist Workers' Party and the Young Socialist Alliance filed suit here today in federal district court against Richard Nixon, John Mitchell, H.R. Haldeman, John Ehrlichman, and 15 other officials and former officials of the U.S. government," end quote. The objectives of the suit were, quote, "for a court injunction to halt all government harassment, intimidation, and illegal spying on the Socialist Workers' Party and Young Socialist Alliance." It also seeks to have the Attorney General's list of, quote, "subversive," end quote, organizations ruled unconstitutional, ... end quote. In addition, the plaintiffs are asking for damages totaling more than $27 million for the numerous violations of rights suffered by the Socialist Workers' Party and Young Socialist Alliance and by individual members of the two groups. The case did not actually come to trial for almost 8 years. Most of the intervening time was taken up with pretrial hearings and in particular attempts by the Socialist Workers' Party and the Young Socialist Alliance attorneys to get the FBI and other government organizations to disclose the details of spying and other activities conducted against the Socialist Workers' Party. Government lawyers fought tenaciously to prevent the details of FBI operations against the Trotskyists from being disclosed in court. At one point, the presiding judge, Thomas Grisa, went so far as to hold Attorney General Griffin Bell in contempt of court for failure to produce in court subpoenaed material, a move which ultimately quashed the Supreme Court. A move that was ultimately quashed by the Supreme Court, Early in the hearings in March 1975, the Socialist Workers' Party did obtain 3,138 pages of FBI memos which disclosed, quote, 41 separate, quote, disruption, end quote, programs against the Socialist Workers' Party and Young Socialist Alliance as part of the FBI's COINTELPRO counterintelligence program. 63, quote, investigative, end quote, files on 15 members of the Socialist Workers' Party and YSA, Young Socialist Alliance, ... 23 quarterly, quote, field reports, end quote, on the Socialist Workers' Party from 1968 to 1974, 3 10-year, quote, summary reports, end quote, on the Socialist Workers' Party dated 1944, 1955, and 1965, end quote. When the Supreme Court ruled finally that the government did not have to turn over to the Socialist Workers' Party Young Socialist Alliance lawyers the files of 16 of the, quote, informants, end quote, it had in the ranks of the party and youth group, Judge Grisa appointed the former New York State Judge Charles Breitel, a, quote, special master, end quote, to look at the material and report to the court. Breitel asserted that, among others, the following, quote, conclusive presumptions, end quote, could be made. Quote, in 1963, informers provided the FBI with diagrams of a Socialist Workers' Party headquarters. The FBI requested the diagrams, quote, to facilitate clandestine entries to the Socialist Workers' Party headquarters, end quote. On one occasion, no date given, smoke bombs were thrown at a Young Socialist Alliance gathering. Quote, the smoke bomb tossing was attributed to FBI activity, end quote. On another occasion, no date given, shots were fired at a local Socialist Workers' Party headquarters. Quote, the shooting was attributable to FBI activity, end quote. In 1975, members of the Socialist Workers' Party and Young Socialist Alliance were attacked at a local Socialist Workers' Party office by a group of young men. Quote, the activity was attributable to FBI activity, end quote. Again in 1975, a Socialist Workers' Party member was attacked while selling newspapers. Quote, the attack was attributable to FBI activity, end quote, end quote. The Breitel report also said that due to FBI efforts, party members had been deprived of their apartments, speakers at Socialist Workers' Party meetings had been arrested, and the spouse of a Socialist Workers' Party member who was not a citizen had been deported. The pre-trial hearings brought out that between 1960 and 1976, the FBI had used 1,300 informers against the Socialist Workers' Party and the Young Socialist Alliance, of whom 300 were members of the two organizations. The most highly placed Socialist Workers' Party figure implicated was Ed Heisler, who in 1980 confessed to the other Socialist Workers' Party leaders that between 1967 and 1971 he had been a paid informer of the FBI. Between 1977 and 1979, he was a full member of the party's National Committee. The Socialist Workers' Party Young Socialist Alliance court proceedings brought President Gerald Ford's Attorney General Edward Levi to issue an order in September 1976 to call off all further surveillance of the two groups. However, there were indications in later years that FBI activities against the Socialist Workers' Party and Young Socialist Alliance were continuing and that other, quote, intelligence, end quote, groups were conducting similar activity, including the CIA, military, naval, and Air Force intelligence, as well as the Secret Service. The passing of old leadership. During the 1970s, the older generation of leaders of the Socialist Workers' Party to a large degree passed from the scene. James P. Cannon, who had been from the inception of American Trotskyism its single most important figure, died in August 1974 at the age of 84. At the time of his death, Cannon was, quote, National Chairman Emeritus, end quote, of the Socialist Workers' Party. 4 years earlier, on February 17, 1970, Vincent R. Dunne, also one of the founders of the American Trotskyist movement and the most important figure in the Minneapolis Teamsters strike of 1934, had died. Vincent R. Dunne had already retired from any leadership role in the party. One of the two or three most important figures in what might be called the second generation of leaders of American Trotskyism and the Socialist Workers' Party, Joseph Hansen, died on January 18, 1974. At the time of his death, Hansen was the editor of Intercontinental Press, which he and his wife, Reba, had founded about 15 years earlier. Two other members of Hansen's generation in Socialist Workers' Party leadership, Farrell Dobbs and George Novak, had largely removed themselves from active leadership positions in the Socialist Workers' Party by the end of the 1970s. Farrell Dobbs had retired as National Secretary in 1972, and George Novak had largely withdrawn from political activities, centering much of his time on his writings about Marxist philosophy. George Novak's wife, Evelyn Reed, died in April 1979. Dobbs died in November 1983. Finally, George Brightman, a fourth member of the Hansen-Novak-Dobbs generation, concentrated most of his time and attention during the 1970s and immediately afterward on his remarkable work of editing the correspondence and other works of Leon Trotsky. The fact and nagging ill health that kept George Brightman from having a major role, that fact and nagging ill health kept George Brightman from having a major role in the councils of the party during most of this period. By the end of the 1970s, leadership of the Socialist Workers' Party was largely in the hands of people who had entered the Socialist Workers' Party during the 1960s and afterwards. They were of a generation who had been at most small children, if they had yet been born, when Trotsky was assassinated and had no memory of close association with Trotsky. This was a not unimportant factor in determining the direction in which they subsequently took the Socialist Workers' Party. Get some water. Splits within the Socialist Workers' Party in the 1970s. I'm about to split. Getting stiff sitting here. The Socialist Workers' Party suffered no major splits during the 1970s. During the first half of the decade, there existed at least three dissident groups within the Socialist Workers' Party, two of which were expelled. During the 1971 National Convention of the Socialist Workers' Party, two opposition groups fought against the party's general line at that time. One of these was the Proletarian Orientation Tendency. It was reported by a source unfriendly to the Socialist Workers' Party to have, quote, centered its struggle against the Socialist Workers' Party abandonment of a proletarian organization, of its abandonment of viewing the working class as the revolutionary force in history. The Proletarian Orientation Tendency reaffirmed the role of the working class, called for the party to sink its roots into the class, and warned that with the abandonment of the class, the party would soon abandon the revolutionary program, end quote. The majority within the Proletarian Orientation Tendency did not push their fight to the point of getting expelled, however. A minority within the group established a separate Leninist faction which continued the struggle. It was reported that, quote, the Leninist faction submitted 4 major documents to both the Socialist Workers' Party and the Fourth International. These documents the Socialist Workers' Party refused to print, and the Fourth International did not acknowledge, end quote. The denouement was that the, quote, Leninist faction then resigned from the Socialist Workers' Party on October 26, 1972, in order to form the Class Struggle League, end quote. In their letter of resignation from the Socialist Workers' Party, the members of the Leninist faction wrote, quote, we have had regional meetings, a convention, and in the process have produced and distributed internally over 60,000 pages of literature, We scrutinize the politics of every political grouping in the Trotskyist spectrum, and most importantly, began the systematic nationally directed tasks of industrial colonization, end quote. The second dissident group in the 1971 convention of the Socialist Workers' Party was the Communist Tendency. It was reported by the same anti-Socialist Workers' Party source previously cited to have, quote, stood on a principled Trotskyist program, analyzing and explaining the degeneration of the Fourth International. The Communist Tendency attacked the Socialist Workers' Party program of nationalism, feminism, and pacifism. The Communist Tendency fought for a return to the proletariat, but a return based on a Trotskyist program, end quote. The Communist Tendency were expelled shortly after the 1971 convention. The Communist Tendency thereupon split, one group joining the International Socialists, the other becoming part of another dissident Trotskyist group, the Vanguard Newsletter. The third dissident element within the Socialist Workers' Party during the 1970s was a small faction which sided with the majority group within the United Secretariat in its controversy with the Socialist Workers' Party after 1969. The United Secretariat the group formed the Internationalist Tendency, IT, and about 100 members of this group were expelled from the Socialist Workers' Party on July 4, 1974. The Internationalist Tendency originally had its origins in the Proletarian Orientation Tendency. Those who formed the Internationalist Tendency did not leave the Socialist Workers' Party when a minority of the Proletarian Orientation Tendency did so to form the Class Struggle League in 1972. By the time of the party's 1978 convention, the Internationalist Tendency reportedly had 120 members in the Socialist Workers' Party Young Socialist Alliance. By that time, they were affiliated with the International Majority Tendency within the United Secretariat, led by Ernest Mandel, Pierre Franck, and Livio Maitan. The expulsion of the Internationalist Tendency became an issue in the Socialist Workers' Party lawsuit against the U.S. government. The party offered documentation on the expulsion of the Internationalist Tendency as supporting evidence to rebut government charges that the Socialist Workers' Party was, quote, terrorist, end quote. After studying this material, George Griesa commented that, quote, there was never anything, in my view, beyond the most tenuous suggestion of a possible implication of violence in the United States, In view of the ouster of the minority faction, I believe that tenuous suggestion has been basically eliminated, end quote. A few months after the expulsion of the Internationalist Tendency from the Socialist Workers' Party, negotiations apparently took place between the Socialist Workers' Party leaders and the European head of the International Majority Tendency for the return of those expelled to the Socialist Party. Subsequently, many members of the Internationalist Tendency were reaccepted. Socialist Workers' Party positions on international issues. The Socialist Workers' Party devoted much of the space in its periodicals in the time of its leadership and rank and file in dealing with the party's position on succeeding international crises of the 1970s. Although most of these positions were more or less, quote, orthodox, end quote, Trotskyist, some caused controversy with other elements of the United Secretariat, and others led ultimately to the possibility of the Socialist Workers' Party's totally breaking with international Trotskyism. For a number of years following the 9th World Congress of the United Secretariat, the USEC, in 1969, the Socialist Workers' Party had led a struggle in the name of Orthodox Trotskyism against the tendency of European leaders of the United Secretariat to support the idea of guerrilla war rather than mass organizations as the road to power. We deal extensively with this controversy elsewhere in this volume. In the period following the end of the Salazar-Caetano, or Caetano, I'm not sure how to pronounce Portuguese names, dictatorship in Portugal, the Socialist Workers' Party was critical of virtually all elements participating in the revolution. Soon after the November 1975 attempt of the communists to organize a coup with sympathetic elements in the armed forces movement, Intercontinental Press wrote that, quote, it was the workers who suffered most after the adventure of the pro-communist party officers in the, quote, extreme left, end quote, on November 25th. Various events of November 25th point to the leaders of the socialist and communist parties as those guilty in this adventure. The forces which consider themselves the, quote, revolutionary left, end quote, also share a great part of the blame, end quote. The Socialist Workers' Party periodical added that, quote, the adventure of November 25th, therefore, was not an attempt to go beyond the class collaborationist policy followed by the Stalinist and Social Democrats. Both have sought to keep the workers over whom they had influence subordinate to the military men while they competed to prove how indispensable they were for the Portuguese capitalist class, end quote. At the time of the Vietnamese invasion of Cambodia, to overthrow the Khmer Rouge government of Pol Pot, the Socialist Workers' Party argued that, quote, with their eyes focused on the Vietnamese Revolution, the imperialists were alarmed by the fall of the Pol Pot regime at the hands of the Kampuchean rebels and the Vietnamese army. The imperialists are afraid that anti-capitalist advances made in Vietnam will be extended to Kampuchea. Kampuchea. How do you say that? I'm going to look it up. I think it's kombucha, right? I thought it was.
Kampuchea.
That's not right.
Kampuchea.
Anyway. I'm just going to say what they say. Maybe that's right. Where am I? The imperialists, let me just read the whole thing. At the time of the Vietnamese invasion of Kampuchea, to overthrow the Khmer Rouge government of Pol Pot, the Socialist Workers' Party argued that, quote, with their eyes focused on the Vietnamese Revolution, the imperialists are alarmed by the fall of the Pol Pot regime at the hands of Kampuchean rebels and the Vietnamese army. The imperialists are afraid that anti-capitalist advances made in Vietnam will be extended to Kampuchea. The Vietnamese participated in the military campaign against the Pol Pot regime as a defensive measure, end quote. The Socialist Workers' Party explained that, quote, the capitalist character of the Kampuchean regime explains why imperialist powers near Southeast Asia, such as Australia, began to view the Pol Pot regime as a, quote, buffer between communist Vietnam and non-communist Thailand, end quote. Vietnam was forced to act defensively in aiding Kampuchean rebels to overthrow Pol Pot and install a regime less hostile to Vietnam, end quote. The Socialist Workers' Party leadership reversed itself with regard to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. As a result adopted by its political committee in January 1980 asserted that, quote, the presence of Soviet troops, by barring the road to counter-revolution, creates a new and more favorable situation. If Soviet troops help the new regime score victories over the reactionaries, this takes pressure off the Afghan revolution and encourages and inspires the struggle for social revolution, end quote. However, in November 1980, the National Committee revised this position, adopting a resolution which stated that, quote, the Soviet bureaucracy's occupation, like all of its preceding actions to prop up this government, did not give an impulse to independent initiative by the city workers or the peasants, The Soviet troops were not greeted by the workers and peasants as reinforcements in the fight to advance their social and political goals, end quote. The National Committee also reversed the conclusion of the Political Committee in January to the effect that the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, quote, strengthens the hand of the anti-imperialist fighters in Iran, and it even buys time for the revolutionary movement in Nicaragua halfway around the world. Needless to say, the impact will be great in Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, and Turkey, end quote. The National Committee, in contrast, declared that, quote, Moscow's role has also negatively affected the class struggle in Iran and Pakistan, end quote. In all its commentaries on Communist Party regimes of Europe and Asia, the Socialist Workers' Party continued during the 1970s to enunciate the traditional Trotskyist position with regard to the nature of those regimes. A clear statement of this position appeared in Young Socialists in April 1979. It said that, quote, in the aftermath of World War II, capitalism was overthrown in Eastern Europe, China, North Korea, and North Vietnam. In all of these countries, the governments are headed by privileged bureaucracies like that in the Soviet Union. Despite the charges which the Soviet and Chinese Stalinists hurl at each other, capitalism has not been restored in any of these countries. They remain worker states transitional between capitalism and socialism, end quote. Still beating that dead horse, huh? This Young Socialist Alliance statement went on to say that, quote, Stalinism is not a necessary or inevitable feature of socialist revolution. The bureaucracies are basically parasites on the workers' states, fulfilling no essential economic function. Their bureaucratic interests are opposed to the interests of the working masses. The further progress of the workers' states, therefore, requires a political revolution, one which will overthrow the bureaucrats and establish democratic forms of rule while maintaining the post-capitalist property forms, end quote. In the case of the Iranian Revolution, the Socialist Workers' Party at first greeted with enthusiasm the fall of the Shah and the assumption of power by Ayatollah Khomeini. Several months before this happened, the militant had words of praise for Khomeini, saying that, quote, although Khomeini subscribes to a religious ideology, the basis of his appeal is not religious reaction. On the contrary, Khomeini has won broad support among the Iranian masses because his firm opposition to the Shah and to the Shah's, quote, modernization, end quote, is progressive, end quote. The assumption of power by Khomeini was greeted by the militant with a headline, quote, victory in Iran, end quote. Although the Socialist Workers' Party mounted extensive protest against the arrest of their fellow Trotskyists by the Khomeini government, they continued to support the Khomeini-led regime. Thus, at the time of the seizure of the U.S. Embassy late in 1979, spokesmen for the party supported the move, putting complete blame on it for the Carter administration rather than anyone in Iran. At the beginning of the Iran-Iraq War, October 1980, the Socialist Workers' Party strongly supported Iran. David Finkel, in an article entitled War in the Middle East, Why Socialists Back Iran, explained that, quote, the Iranian workers and peasants are continuing their mass mobilizations. They are continuing to organize themselves and to engage in political discussion. Their revolution is still alive. It is still developing. End quote. There's an article, at least one article, but maybe a couple on Iran on this channel that does not have such a warm position towards developments in Iran. David Frankel noted that both the Communist Today Party and the Trotskyist HKE, quote, put out legal newspapers and maintained public headquarters, end quote, and, quote, most important of all are the gains made by the masses of workers and peasants because of the revolution, end quote. Frankel had no comment on the theocracy which had been installed by the Khomeini regime. The Socialist Workers' Party supported the rise of solidarity in Poland. However, the Socialist Workers' Party leadership's reactions after the suppression of solidarity at the end of 1981 became an issue of dispute in the factional struggle which was beginning to develop within the party at that time. Finally, the Socialist Workers' Party continued during the 1970s and thereafter its very strong support of the Castro regime in Cuba. It expressed equal enthusiasm for the Sandinista government which came to power in Nicaragua in the summer of 1979, and for the regime of Maurice Bishop, which seized control of the Caribbean island of Grenada in early 1979. Is it Grenada? I feel like whenever I hear it, I think of like a guy saying Grenada, but I'm not. I think it's Grenada. Oh well. Probably pronounced every word that I've said today wrong. During the early 1970s, the Socialist Workers' Party had reached the high point of its influence in a series of major movements which were then of importance in national politics. Thereafter, with the decline or reorientation of those movements, the Socialist Workers' Party influence declined. It met this new situation at the end of the decade by a new turn toward the organized labor movement, which it had largely ignored for almost 2 decades. However, after 5 years, there was a relatively little to show for this, quote, turn, end quote, in terms of membership or influence among the organized workers. Meanwhile, a new generation had largely taken over leadership. By the early 1980s, that leadership was taking the party in a direction which threatened to separate the party entirely from international Trotskyism. Thanks for listening.